The voice, faint and frayed, broke through the static like a thread pulled tight to its limit. On the other end of the radio, the Coast Guard Command Center froze. Operators leaned in, straining to isolate the transmission. Then came another burst, warped, panicked breathing, the sharp crackle of interference, and something else, something beneath the words. A low hum, mechanical yet alive, like the grinding pulse of something massive just beneath the waves. Coordinates, not holding, everything's off. The sky, the voice faltered, trembling now, the last fragments stitched together by static. It's not the sky. Then, silence. No Mayday confirmation. No distress beacon. No transponder ping. Just dead air. The USCGC Vigilant, a 210-foot cutter with 5 seasoned men aboard, was gone, vanished mid-transmission off the coast of Florida near the edge of the Bermuda Triangle. For 7 hours, the comms team ran protocol. Frequencies swept. Aircraft scrambled. Radar scans pushed past their limits. Nothing. It was as if the ship had been erased, not lost, not sunken, simply removed. Official logs labeled it a temporary communications blackout due to electrical disturbance. Internally, however, there were whispers. One technician refused to return to the operations floor, repeating only one phrase to his supervisor: the signal wasn't bouncing. It was being blocked. No explanation followed. He took personal leave that day and never came back. In the months that followed, fragments of that final transmission circulated within closed channels, quietly passed among field officers, never acknowledged in reports. The voice was eventually identified: Petty Officer 2nd Class Daniel Kane. A veteran with over 10 years at sea, no history of incident, no signs of instability. His personnel file had no red flags, until the day he disappeared. Unofficially, some believed Kane was still alive, adrift somewhere between dimensions of time and place that instruments can't measure. Others said his last message was a warning, a final broadcast before crossing into something humanity wasn't meant to witness. What made it more disturbing was what didn't appear in the transmission. No screams. No chaos. No fire or collision. Just a measured fear, the kind that suggests not sudden danger, but slow realization. One analyst, after reviewing the waveform of the audio, claimed something was embedded in the background noise, modulated tones that didn't match any natural interference or known machine. When he played it back through a frequency isolator, he said he heard a voice that didn't belong to Kane. A second voice, almost whispering, but layered, speaking in pulses, not words. That file was confiscated within 24 hours. The analyst was reassigned to a weather station in Alaska. None of this was made public. Officially, the Vigilant experienced minor instrument failure, returned to base, and the crew was reassigned. There was no record of the radio call, no indication the ship had ever been in distress, and no mention of Daniel Kane. His name was quietly removed from internal rosters. But some remember. Some kept copies. Some still hear that call, late at night when they monitor the open channels, as if it's still out there, looping through the static, waiting for someone to answer. And then last month, a private vessel passing through the same coordinates logged an automated distress signal, old Coast Guard frequency, outdated encryption, tagged with a call sign that hasn't been used since 1987. The signal ended the same way Kane's did. Not with noise, but with silence that felt like something listening. For as long as anyone can remember, the waters between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico have carried a reputation that defies logic. The Bermuda Triangle, an expanse of ocean that has devoured entire squadrons mid-flight, erased ships without a trace, and silenced radios in the blink of an eye. Sailors whisper about it in bars, pilots avoid it without saying so out loud, and scientists pretend it's just bad weather, human error, or magnetic anomalies. But every few decades, something slips through the cracks, something too strange to ignore, too terrifying to explain away. And in 1987, one of those things carried a Coast Guard cutter called the Vigilant into the Triangle's teeth, and brought back a man who would never be the same. Petty Officer Daniel Kane didn't talk about what happened at first. Not to his superiors. Not to his family. Not even to the crewmates who were there beside him that night, staring into the same impossible lights, hearing the same distorted sounds, feeling the same creeping distortion of time and space. They were all told the same thing: what they saw didn't happen. What they heard was a malfunction. What they felt was the stress of the job. The paperwork they were ordered to sign, The ones marked confidential, incident classified, and discussion prohibited under threat of federal charge made it clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a burial. But secrets have weight. They don't stay buried. Not when they haunt the people who carry them. Kane's logs were seized, but not before he had written down fragments in shorthand on scraps of paper, stray details he didn't want to forget. He left a coded note in the pages of a maintenance manual the night they docked. Years later, that manual surfaced in a Coast Guard surplus auction, purchased by a collector who knew what he was looking for. Inside were 5 lines, handwritten and smudged, but legible. The last line read, "Don't trust the sky when it stops moving." Kane's mental health deteriorated quickly. He was pulled from active duty 6 months after the incident and given an early retirement package, generous, sealed, and conditioned on total silence. He never violated it publicly. But in 2006, after nearly 2 decades of obscurity, he was found living in a remote trailer outside Pensacola, surrounded by photographs of clouds, hand-drawn maps of Atlantic currents, and clippings of every triangle disappearance since 1945. The few people who visited him said he was polite, but distant, distracted, obsessed. He'd ask questions no one could answer. Did they ever find the Beechcraft from 61? Why was Flight 19's radio line open but silent? Do clouds ever move backward where you live? What disturbed people most wasn't what Kane said, it was how he said it. He never sounded unhinged. He didn't scream or shake. His voice was calm, precise, military to the core. But the way he'd glance out the window mid-sentence, or fall silent when the weather shifted, made it clear he wasn't looking for answers. He was waiting, watching, as if something he'd seen once might find him again. 4 years, the government denied even the smallest detail about the Vigilance 1987 patrol. No incident report. No anomaly. No evidence it was ever inside triangle coordinates. But in 2012, a Freedom of Information Act request turned up a redacted transcript buried in a Coast Guard archive. It referenced compass deviation beyond known limits, auditory hallucinations consistent among personnel, and, most cryptically, unverified aerial visual phenomena of layered luminosity. The report was unsigned. The case number didn't match any official incident log. But the final line, barely visible beneath the redactions, read, "Subject Daniel Kane reports persistent dream state interference. Continued observation recommended." None of this appeared in public databases. No journalist ever covered it. The incident was quietly folded into the Triangle's long legacy of unsolved events. But the fact that Kane's name was still on a government watchlist as late as 2019, 32 years after the event, raises an unsettling question. What exactly did he witness that night? And more importantly, did something follow him back? The summer of 1987 was unremarkable on the surface. Calm seas, routine assignments, and the kind of predictable weather that lulled even the most experienced sailors into mechanical rhythms. Petty Officer Daniel Kane had spent over a decade in the U.S. Coast Guard by then, long enough to stop counting the number of patrols, long enough to know the difference between stories that kept recruits entertained and the quiet, creeping moments when something genuinely felt off. He wasn't green. He wasn't superstitious. And he sure as hell didn't believe in ghost waters or ancient sea curses. The Bermuda Triangle, to him, was a convenient scapegoat for bad maintenance, worse leadership, and unfortunate weather patterns. Until the day his own logic started folding in on itself. The USCGC Vigilant was a solid ship. Functional, no frills. She'd seen storms, rescues, search missions, and surveillance runs. Kane had served on her long enough to trust her more than most people. That July, they were scheduled for a 5-day patrol stretching into a region the crew jokingly referred to as the Edge. Not because of any real fear, just tradition. Sailors are sentimental like that. But deep down, even the most seasoned among them knew the coordinates they were brushing against had a reputation. Everyone knew someone who'd seen things out there. Unmarked lights. Lost time. Static that hummed like it was thinking. But no one ever had proof. And maybe that was worse. Their orders were vague, standard perimeter patrol. Eyes open for unusual maritime activity. No engagement. A phrase that said nothing and everything. What made it strange wasn't the language, but the timing. Patrol routes were rarely adjusted at the last minute, but this one was. And not by command from the local station. This came from higher up, Homeland Security, though that branch wasn't supposed to oversee this region. Kane had flagged it mentally, but said nothing. You don't last in the military by asking the wrong questions too early. They set off from Key West just before dawn. The air was thick, the sky a pale blue haze that looked more like a painting than weather. The first 2 days were uneventful. Routine drills. Equipment checks. Kane spent most of his time in the comms room, logging traffic, monitoring channel chatter, calibrating instruments that didn't need calibrating just to keep his hands busy. But something was wrong, and he could feel it before he could explain it. The ocean wasn't behaving the way it should. Not violently, but subtly, like it was breathing out of rhythm. By day 3, Kane began noticing patterns he couldn't dismiss. The stars didn't align with the charts. GPS pinged them a few nautical miles south of where they actually were. Compasses wavered, not spinning wildly, just hesitating, like they were second-guessing themselves. He reported the discrepancies. The response came back like it always did, noted. Monitor. Continue patrol. But it was more than just instruments. It was the crew. They moved slower, spoke less, ate in silence. Not out of fatigue, but something else. A heaviness. As if the ship itself were dragging them into stillness. At night, Kane began having dreams, not the fractured, drifting kind that come from too much sun or too little sleep, but vivid ones. Hyper-real. Of standing on the deck alone, looking out at an ocean that reflected no stars. Of seeing another Vigilant sailing parallel to theirs, identical in every way, with no crew aboard. In the dream, he would try to signal it. No answer. Just the low, mechanical hum of water pushing against metal. On the 4th evening, as the sky dimmed into a soft, colorless dusk, Kane stood at the stern and looked west. The horizon shimmered. Not from heat. From motion. As if the air itself was rippling, not upward, but inward. Folding. That was the moment he realized they hadn't seen another vessel in over 30 hours. No freighters. No fishing boats. No aircraft overhead. Just them. In open water that no longer felt like it belonged to the world. And when he stepped back inside to log another set of skewed coordinates, he found the radio's emergency beacon had silently tripped, without any of them triggering it. Ask ChatGPT. It began just after midnight, as the Vigilant crossed an unmarked sector roughly 70 nautical miles northeast of Andros Island. The water had gone strangely still, the kind of stillness sailors don't trust. Kane sat alone in the comms bay, flipping between emergency frequencies, trying to pin down a low, intermittent hiss that wasn't supposed to be there. At first, he thought it was atmospheric interference, harmless, common. But it had a rhythm, almost like breathing, woven too tightly to be static, too irregular to be mechanical. He didn't mention it to anyone. Not yet. When the fog arrived, it didn't roll in from the horizon. It simply appeared. One moment, the night was clear. The next, they were surrounded, encased in a dense, silver-gray wall that swallowed the ship whole. Lights barely pushed through. The sound of waves against the hull was gone, replaced by something more muted, like the ocean had turned soft. The deck crew assumed it was a squall and began routine checks, but Kane felt something colder at play. There was no wind, no pressure drop, no electric tension in the air. It wasn't natural. It was still. On the bridge, the radar screen pulsed erratically. For every sweep, 1 or 2 blips would appear and vanish before registering, faint, off-center, drifting too close to be debris, too controlled to be drift. One of the junior officers, Ensign Briggs, recalibrated the system twice before stepping back and admitting, under his breath, that it felt like the screen was trying not to show something. Kane caught the comment but said nothing. The moment passed quickly. In the silence that followed, no one dared admit they were uneasy. The compass issue followed. Navigational bearings spun just slightly off true north, then sharply, then began circling like a needle chasing a magnet that wasn't there. They replaced the unit, checked the backup, rebooted the system. Nothing held steady. At one point, the magnetic deviation hit 6 degrees without explanation. One crewman suggested solar interference, but Kane knew that wasn't it. The solar charts were clean. Whatever was distorting their instruments wasn't coming from space. It was closer. Much closer. The whispers started around 0215 hours. At first, it sounded like a bleed-through from a civilian band, muffled voices in a language no one could identify, chopped and layered like a conversation filtered through water. Kane leaned in, adjusted the gain, tried isolating the signal. It was there 1 second, gone the next. It never repeated, never looped. Just fragments. And then came something worse, a phrase, in English this time, but warped like a broken recording. "Why are you still here?" Kane froze. The room, already cold, felt like it dropped another 10 degrees. He played the clip back. Nothing. Just silence and hiss. He reported it to the XO, Lieutenant Rourke, who listened carefully, gave a tight nod, and said, "Don't chase shadows, Kane. You'll find more than you want to." It sounded rehearsed. Like something he'd been told to say. Like he'd been briefed before they ever left port. That was the first time Kane felt it, that creeping realization that someone on board might know more than they were admitting. By dawn, the fog hadn't lifted. It clung to them like skin, dense and absolute. The stars were gone. The sun rose without light. Just a dull grayness overhead, as if they were sealed inside some kind of massive dome. Sound didn't carry right. Voices barely traveled from one end of the deck to the other. Machinery hummed strangely, and the diesel engines echoed as if they were in a tunnel. Kane stepped onto the bridge, looked out over the bow, and saw nothing. Just fog, swallowing the sea like it had never existed. Then came the knock. One single knock against the hull, starboard side. Not metal on metal. Not driftwood. Something deliberate. Kane and Rourke rushed outside, thinking it might be debris or a passing vessel that had broken through the fog. But there was nothing. No shadow, no ripple. Just open water that didn't move. That night, the fog deepened. And somewhere in the static of Channel 16, Kane heard it again. A whisper, barely audible, just 2 words this time. But they weren't coming from the radio, they were coming through it. Turn back. By the time night swallowed the last traces of the sun, the fog had begun to thin, but the unease had only deepened. Visibility stretched no farther than a few hundred yards, and the ocean remained eerily calm, like a mirror stretched tight over something watching from beneath. The crew clung to protocol, running systems checks, verifying bearings, pretending the silence didn't feel wrong. But their eyes lingered longer on the water now. And no one, not even Rourke, spoke above a whisper. Just before 2,200 hours, the first light appeared. Not from above, but from below. A dull, sickly blue pulse, brief, dim, and gone. At first, Kane thought it was bioluminescence, a patch of disturbed algae catching the moonlight. But there was no moon. And then it pulsed again, brighter, steadier, followed by another, and another, until 5 distinct orbs glowed beneath the hull, each moving independently, yet clearly coordinated. They circled once, then held position beneath the Vigilant as if waiting. Kane alerted the bridge, and within minutes, a crowd had gathered on the deck, peering over the rails in silence. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They watched the lights in stunned disbelief, their minds scrambling for explanations that refused to take shape. They weren't flares. They weren't reflections. They were too deep, too symmetrical, too alive. Then came the sound. It began as a low vibration, almost imperceptible, a sensation more than a noise. The hull trembled softly, like the ship was being touched by something immense, just beneath the surface. It grew slowly, crawling up through the metal, into their boots, into their bones. A frequency that seemed tuned to the part of the brain that knows when it's being hunted. Monitors flickered. Power surged and dropped in waves. Comms went offline. The compass spun freely. Even the emergency backups failed, as if whatever was down there had reached up and wrapped its hand around the ship's throat. Rourke ordered a systems shutdown to prevent overload, but nothing responded. The Vigilant was no longer in control of herself. Kane stood amid the chaos, fixated on a point beyond the fog. Something was coming. He couldn't see it, but he felt it, like a pressure pressing inward, collapsing the space between moments. He raised his binoculars, sweeping across the dark horizon, and that's when he saw it. It wasn't light. It wasn't shape. It was absence, An outline darker than the dark itself, massive, still, and utterly wrong. No lines, no structure. Just a void in motion, impossibly vast, gliding just below the surface. It passed beneath the Vigilant with a speed that defied scale, the water above it bulging slightly, then settling like breath held and released. Kane lowered the binoculars slowly, afraid to blink, afraid to speak, as if acknowledging it would call it back. Below deck, crewmen reported hearing voices again, not through the radio this time, but through the hull. Soft murmurs, as though the sea itself had a language it was whispering in rhythm with the lights. Some said the voices were speaking to them. One man, a young mechanic named Flores, locked himself in the engine room and began reciting passages from a journal that didn't exist. He said he was just repeating what they wanted remembered. Up top, Rourke issued the order to mark coordinates, launch a buoy, and prepare to reverse course. Kane hesitated. There was no data to transmit. No signals would leave this place. But the order was clear. As he moved to comply, a new light surged from beneath, brighter, closer, and directly beneath the center of the ship. The entire vessel lurched, not from impact, but from something passing directly under it, so close the keel screamed with the pressure. Alarms triggered across the lower decks. Water sloshed into sealed corridors. For a moment, every electronic system on board came back to life, and then died again in unison. And from the corner of Kane's vision, something broke the surface. A shape, just a glimpse, rising halfway above the waterline, silent and towering. It didn't glow. It didn't shimmer. It simply watched. Then it slid back under. Ask ChatGPT. The sea should have swallowed the light. That's what Kane thought, even as it began, how unnatural it felt to see those orbs rise not from sky or mast but from beneath, ascending like thoughts surfacing from the subconscious. There were 5 of them at first, hovering inches above the waterline, each radiating a pale, bluish-white glow that lit the deck of the Vigilant in soft pulses. The light didn't reflect, it absorbed, wrapping itself around the metal and the faces of the crew like it was alive, studying them. Kane stepped forward, instinct pulling him toward the rail, but his body resisted. Not from fear. From something else. A kind of pressure on the mind, like he was being asked a question in a language he didn't understand. No one gave orders. The command structure dissolved in a matter of seconds. Men froze mid-step. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even the wind stopped. Kane turned to say something, he doesn't remember what, to Rourke, but the words never made it to his mouth. The air had gone thick, and his breath came out slower than it should have. Every movement, his own and those around him, looked slowed, distorted, as though filmed underwater. The glow intensified, but it wasn't bright. It was deep, penetrating. Memory stopped working like it should. Later, Kane would describe it as moments folding in on themselves. He remembered standing on the deck, and then, just as clearly, being inside a darkened corridor below deck, though he never moved. 1 second he was staring at the lights, and the next, he was in the engine room, his hand pressed against the wall, whispering words he couldn't recall. Then back again. Then elsewhere. He saw himself in places he hadn't entered, watching events from outside his body. But what terrified him most was what didn't belong in any of those places. Shapes, too tall to be human, without edges, passing through the corridors in silence. Others experienced similar lapses. One officer stood on the bow whispering coordinates to no one. A petty officer locked himself in the supply closet and began crying, except he insisted he never remembered doing it. Flores, the mechanic, collapsed near the comms room. When Kane helped him up, the younger man looked at him and said, "It's not the water that's deep. It's the air." He had no memory of saying it when questioned later. It was as if thoughts were being implanted, brief flashes of meaning that belonged to something else entirely. The climax came without sound. One of the orbs rose directly above the deck, hovering just feet over the main mast. A light column extended downward, bathing the entire vessel in a shaft of impossible clarity. For a moment, the fog was gone. The sea, the sky, the very air, still, open, exposed. The men were suspended not physically, but mentally, caught in something that refused to obey time. Kane remembered blinking once and seeing every detail of the ship in perfect freeze frame. Rusted bolts, frayed rope, a drop of water paused midair, like reality itself had been halted for inspection. And then it changed. The light pulsed, and with it came something Kane never spoke of again, visions not like dreams but memories he didn't own. A vast cavern, black and endless, lit by a lattice of symbols that vibrated. A sound that wasn't a sound, but a knowing, something communicating not with words, but with presence. Kane fell to his knees. Not from pain, but from the weight of something that felt older than language, older than thought. He wasn't being shown anything. He was being rewritten. Then, it ended. The orbs collapsed into the sea with no splash, no wake, and no goodbye. Lights flickered. Engines groaned back to life. Radios returned, spitting static and clipped Coast Guard channels. Men stirred as though waking from sedation, eyes glazed, lips cracked, memories incomplete. Kane touched his forehead and realized he'd been bleeding, though there was no wound. Rourke was nowhere to be found. His station empty. His voice silent. And in the logbook, a fresh entry, handwritten in Kane's own handwriting, but with letters shaped unlike his own. A date 3 days into the future. A location they'd never planned to sail. And one line beneath it. It knows the name you haven't said yet. Ask ChatGPT. They moved like they were responding to thought, not sound. The orbs, no longer silent sentinels but coordinated forces, began drifting closer, their light deepening from pale blue to something darker, almost violet, like bruised sky just before a storm. Kane tried to rally the bridge, but the command structure had broken completely. Rourke was still missing, and half the crew wandered the decks as if drugged, while the others refused to speak at all. The comms were nothing but static, pure, dead weight humming in his ears, even on emergency channels. No SOS reached shore. Every burst of signal was swallowed in transmission, as if the air around them had thickened into something that consumed technology like oxygen. Kane gave the order anyway. Fire flares. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was instinct. Maybe he wanted something, anything, to look human in the face of whatever had made the world stop spinning. 3 red streaks arced through the dark, high above the vigilance mast. But before they could reach their peak, something unseen caught them. The flares blinked out midair, like candles pinched between fingers. No smoke, no ember fall. Just gone. That's when the lights answered. They rose again, now in formation, tight, deliberate, circling the ship like predators testing a perimeter. Their glow no longer cast shadows. It consumed them. Kane backed away from the railing as the vibration returned, stronger this time, rattling the very bones of the vigilant. The ship groaned under pressure that didn't come from the sea. There was no storm, no current, but it felt like something massive was forcing the ship downward, not physically, but mentally, like a presence trying to press them through the water with sheer intent. Crew members collapsed to the deck, clutching their heads, whispering fragments of thoughts that didn't belong to them. One man tried to leap overboard, screaming that he had to answer it, before being dragged back by 2 others, both crying silently as they held him down. Kane realized then that this wasn't a test of endurance or firepower. It was something older. A quiet interrogation. A peeling back of who they thought they were. Not torture. Study. And then Kane saw it again. Just off the starboard bow, no longer a shadow, but a shape. Angular, shifting, made of no material he could name. It hovered above the water without disturbing it, pulsing with synchronized rhythm to the vibrations crawling through the ship. For a split second, Kane could feel it inside his mind, not reading, but rearranging. His own memories twisted, the face of his mother blurred into that of a shipmate, a childhood bedroom flickering into a flooded corridor of the vigilant. He screamed, but no sound came out. Just static. In the command room, the emergency generator began its death rattle. There were maybe seconds before they'd lose all power. Kane scanned the systems and saw it, a manual override buried 3 layers deep, installed long ago as a failsafe against electromagnetic interference. No one ever used it. No one ever expected to. But it would take everything offline, navigation, radar, lights, life support, just long enough to force a hard reboot. Like forcing a heartbeat back into a dying body. He knew it might kill them. A blackout this deep, this far from shore, could send them straight to the bottom. But staying online meant staying visible. Staying seen. He didn't ask permission. He flipped the switch. The ship went black. Every bulb, every screen, every whisper of machine stopped in unison. For the first time in hours, the vibration ceased. The orbs halted mid-glide. The pressure lifted. And the sea went normal. Not calm. Not quiet. Just normal. Like something had let go. Like the eyes had blinked shut. Power returned 10 seconds later, the lights flickering back with a stuttering hum. The orbs were gone. The fog dissipating. The crew slowly coming back to themselves, as if waking from sleepwalking. But Kane wasn't. He stared at the console, his fingers still resting on the override. His knuckles bloodless. His lips moving without voice. A crewman approached to ask what he'd done, what he'd seen. Kane didn't respond. He just looked up, eyes wide and unblinking, and asked a question that didn't belong to him. Which version of us made it back? They reached port under a sky that felt too blue. Everything looked sharper, louder, more real than it should have, as if the world was overcompensating for what they'd just come from. The Vigilant limped into the naval station like a ghost ship, scarred but intact. Technically, physically, the hull held together. Mechanically, the systems had recovered. But something intangible had broken loose inside that vessel, and not a single man on board knew how to name it. What they did know, what they wouldn't speak aloud, was that whatever happened out there wasn't going to be explained. It was going to be erased. The Coast Guard brass was already waiting at the dock, but it wasn't the usual portside welcoming crew. These weren't officers Kane had seen before. No insignia. No greetings. No official debrief. The men who stepped aboard didn't ask questions, they gave instructions. The crew was separated, escorted off the ship in small groups, taken to different rooms in a windowless government facility less than a mile from the water. No one knew who was being questioned or for how long. Hours passed. Then days. No phones. No media. No contact with family. Kane was kept in a cold room for 16 hours before anyone spoke to him. The man who entered didn't offer a name, didn't take notes. He just asked one question: what exactly did you see? When Kane hesitated, the man repeated the question, same tone, same pacing, like reading from a script he'd used before. Kane gave a version of the story, but not the full truth. He left out the hallucinations, the flickering timelines, the question that slipped from his mouth at the end. He didn't say what he'd written in the logbook. He couldn't say it, because the moment he tried, something inside him recoiled. Like the memory had been laced with something that punished access. When the interview ended, Kane was escorted back to the Vigilant to retrieve his things. His personal log was missing. So was the backup hard drive from the communications room. In their place, a new report, typed, generic, sanitized, was stamped and filed into the ship's record. It described atmospheric anomalies, navigational interference, and temporary system malfunctions. Not one word about the orbs, or the light, or the voices. And in a line near the bottom, a single sentence stood out: crew advised against further speculation regarding classified phenomena encountered at sea. One by one, the rest of the crew disappeared from the chain of command. Some were transferred to distant outposts. Others were honorably discharged with vague language about fitness evaluations. Flores, the mechanic who'd collapsed on the deck, never returned to duty. His military email bounced back with a deactivation notice, and none of his calls were ever answered. Kane tried. Once. The voice that picked up didn't sound like Flores. It only said, "wrong number," and hung up. Rumors spread in whispers, quickly and quietly. A few former crewmates hinted that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened in the Triangle. That similar sightings, similar silences, had been buried just as fast. An old chief from another cutter told Kane over a beer that he once saw a report where 3 vessels had lost contact in the exact same patch of ocean over 30 years ago. None of those cases were ever mentioned again. No recovery, no press, no memorial. Just vanished from the map. Like someone had decided what the ocean could be allowed to reveal, and what had to be forgotten. And then there was the black folder. It arrived at Kane's apartment 2 weeks after his reassignment. No return address. No postage. Inside were 6 photos, blurry and degraded, still frames of the Vigilant's radar screen during the event. In one of them, a single anomaly glowed in the shape of an eye. No note. No explanation. Just a small, stamped phrase on the back of each photo: expired classification, do not duplicate. Kane didn't sleep that night. Not because of what he remembered, but because something in him had changed. Not a belief. Not a fear. Something deeper. As if part of him had stayed behind, suspended in that unmarked place the maps refused to name. And in the silence of that long, sleepless night, a new question began whispering in his mind. Not in his voice. Not from memory. Why do you think we let you leave? Time did what it always does. It moved forward, quietly erasing the edges of memory, filing pain into corners the mind stops visiting. But for Daniel Kane, now deep into retirement and long out of uniform, that night never left. It lived with him, etched into the muscles of his jaw when sleep became impossible, lingering in the spaces between blinking lights or the low hum of power lines. He could go days without remembering it clearly. Then a smell, a flicker on a broken screen, or a static glitch on the radio would pull it all back in an instant, like a cold hand closing around his throat. He told himself he'd imagined parts of it. That trauma had warped the story. But the things he couldn't explain never faded. And neither did the silence that followed. He never talked about it, not really. Not to his wife, not to his kids, not to the VA psychiatrist who asked politely but too soon. Every time he tried to name it, something in his throat closed, like a locked door in his own mind. But the dreams, those kept coming. They weren't nightmares in the classic sense. No running, no screaming. Just the same slow descent into stillness. The ship. The lights. The impossible shape rising. The soundless question that was never answered. Or maybe was, but in a way he hadn't understood. The dream always ended the same way, with him waking up, drenched in sweat, whispering coordinates that never appeared on any map. In 2019, a Freedom of Information Act request was filed by a journalist digging into Cold War naval anomalies. Most of the request came back blacked out, just routine drills and radar glitches. But one file, buried under layers of reclassification, slipped through. It contained a single page. Half legible. Dated July 1987. Location, off the Florida coast. Vessel, USCGC Vigilant. Summary, unknown aerial submersible activity observed. Electromagnetic interference. Non-biological auditory hallucinations reported among crew. Incident closed under Section 37A, Environmental Distortion Protocol. Kane read that page 100 times. Memorized it. Section 37A didn't exist in any public Coast Guard manual. Non-biological hallucinations, a phrase so absurdly clinical it made him laugh out loud when he first read it. But it was real. It meant someone else had seen enough to write it down. And if one page made it through, what had been buried with the rest? Around the same time, he began receiving anonymous emails. Short. Cryptic. One contained a GPS coordinate. When he checked it on satellite view, it showed open water. Nothing else. Another included only a name, Lieutenant Sasha Marquez. He remembered her. A Navy sonar tech he met years ago at a symposium. She'd mentioned, offhandedly, that her submarine had once gone dark for 7 minutes over the Puerto Rico Trench. No one ever explained why. She never responded to his follow-up message. Then her email bounced back. Account deactivated. More fragments followed. Stories from others. A pilot who'd blacked out mid-flight over the triangle and woke up flying in the wrong direction with 27 minutes unaccounted for. A diver who swore he saw lights moving beneath the ocean floor. A sailor who painted a mural on the side of his shed that bore an uncanny resemblance to the shape Kane saw in the mist. None of them went public. None of them had proof. Just echoes. Just pieces. Like all of them were survivors of something that didn't want to be remembered. Kane kept everything. Printed it all. Filed it away in a black binder marked only with a date, July 1987. He didn't know what he was building. A case file? A confession? A warning? It felt like all three. Part of him feared reopening the wound, feared what else he'd find. But another part, the part that had stared into that hovering light and come back changed, needed to know. Not what it was, but why him. And then last spring, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a single flash drive. No note. No label. Just one file. A voice recording. It began with static, then a faint humming, and then, unmistakably, his own voice, cracked, panicked, from the deck of the Vigilant, 32 years ago, saying words he didn't remember ever speaking. "You said, there are places on this planet that have been mapped but never understood. Coordinates that exist on charts and in memory, yet defy every effort to be contained by explanation. The Bermuda Triangle is one of them. It's been dismissed by skeptics and shrouded in folklore, but for those who've brushed up against its edge, truly touched it, there's no need for belief. Only silence." What happened to Daniel Kane wasn't a story designed to entertain. It wasn't about ghosts or sea monsters. It was about something far more unnerving, an intelligence or presence that doesn't want to be found, doesn't need recognition, and doesn't care whether we survive the encounter. Kane never found closure. Not because the answers weren't out there, but because they were just out of reach, layered beneath decades of denial, buried beneath institutions built to ensure people forgot. He spent his final years not trying to prove what he saw, but trying to understand why it let him go. Not all of the Vigilance crew made it out whole. Some never served again. Others never spoke. And a few, those whose names never appeared in any transfer records, may have simply disappeared in the weeks that followed, folded into a classified system designed to erase inconvenient truths. And still, the triangle waits. Not like a trap. More like a threshold. A test. It doesn't always take. Sometimes it just watches. Sometimes it returns things, changed. Declassified files only scratch the surface. Most of them don't even mention the real anomalies. Just vague references, electromagnetic anomalies, temporal distortions, psychological disorientation due to environmental stressors. But if you look closely, the patterns emerge. Identical coordinates, years apart. Identical symbols sketched by unrelated witnesses. Identical humming sounds recorded on lost aircraft transmissions. There's consistency in the chaos. That's what makes it harder to ignore. Some say Kane was part of a failed experiment. A Cold War project designed to manipulate perception through electromagnetic fields. Others whisper that what the Vigilant encountered wasn't built by man, or meant for us to understand. And then there's a smaller group, a quieter one, who believe Kane and his crew stepped briefly outside of linear time. That the orbs, the shadows, the warped memories weren't invaders, but observers. Surveyors. Cartographers of consciousness. They didn't cause the anomalies, they were the anomalies. Studying us the way we study insects in glass. Not hostile. Just indifferent. But what if it's simpler than all of that? What if the Bermuda Triangle is a wound? A scar in the world where the laws of reality thin, and something older leaks through? The ocean holds our beginnings. Maybe it remembers more than we do. And maybe, in places like that, deep, cold, and deliberately forgotten, it speaks. Not in words, but in disruption. Displacement. Disappearance. Daniel Kane never recorded another official statement. But in one of the last notes he scrawled into the margins of his original, confiscated ship log, later recovered and authenticated by a private investigator, he wrote something that still unsettles those who've seen it. No context. No explanation. Just a final thought scratched in haste. It said, if it ever opens again, don't go near it. Don't even look. And beneath that, 3 letters. Written as if he didn't want to be the one to spell them out. BTS. Some say it stands for Bermuda Triangle Syndrome. Others think it's code. But whatever it means, whatever Kane saw, whatever knew he saw it, hasn't surfaced again. Not officially. But somewhere, under miles of pressure and silence, it waits. And you have to wonder, what happens when it no longer wants to be hidden?